Leading Ideas Talks podcast is brought to you by the Lewis Center for Church Leadership of Wesley Theological Seminary in Washington, D.C. Subscribe free to our weekly e-newsletter, Leading Ideas, at churchleadership.com/leading ideas. Leading Ideas Talks is also brought to you by the Taking Church to the Community Video Toolkit. Explore strategies your congregation can use to reach beyond its walls with worship, community events, ministries, and service. Learn more and watch introductory videos at churchleadership.com/shop. And remember, to stay up to date with the latest church leadership strategies and information, please like and subscribe to this channel and click the bell icon to get updates for new videos. What can we learn about congregational revitalization, fresh expressions, and evangelism from the Methodist Church in Britain? In this episode, Trey Hall shares insights on these subjects, drawing from his experience in the United States and Great Britain.
Welcome to Leading Ideas Talks, a podcast featuring thought leaders and innovative practitioners. I am Douglas Poe, the director of the Lewis Center, and your host for this talk. Joining me is Reverend Trey Hall, who's the Director of Evangelism and Growth for the Methodist Church of Britain. Our focus for this podcast is creating vital congregations. Trey, welcome to our conversation today.
It's great to be with you.
I want to begin, Trey. Of course, I know you from the time we spent together years ago on Emory's campus. But for those who don't know you, they hear about you being in England, and that seems strange if you're from America. So can you share a little bit about your professional journey and how you ended up in this position?
Yeah. So I'm in Britain, but I still say y'all. So I've got my deep Southern formation there.
I like it.
I'm trying to convince all the British Methodists that y'all is the most inclusive way of referring to the people of God. So I still have a lot of work to do to get.
I was going to say, how's that going for you?
I think they're open. They're open to it. So it's become a little bit of a joke in the Methodist Church in Britain, but we're playful with it. So yeah, I'm a child of the South. Grew up in Memphis, and then went to seminary at Candler where we met. And then my home conference is the Northern Illinois Conference, and served there for 15 years as a pastor of a suburban church, and then a pastor of an inner kind of sort of not inner city, but a city church, and then helped start a new church, multi-site church there in Chicago. So most of my ministry in the States was as a church planter. And then I fell in love before I started working in Northern Illinois. I had an internship with the British Methodist Church straight from Candler, and which wonderful time here serving a circuit in British Methodism. Fell in love with the Brit. We moved back to the States in our 20s, had our life there, and then it was time for me to follow my spouse. So we moved back to Britain. And then I started kind of doing coaching for pioneers, and which is the term in Britain for church planters, pioneers and church planters, and then started working for a British Methodist district, which is sort of like a conference and United Methodists kind of speak, and did that for a few years, helping them think about church planting, pioneering, and evangelism. And then the British Methodist Church, the Methodist Church in Britain, started a new kind of emphasis on evangelism and growth here about 4 years ago now. And so I was appointed to that role.
Great. I appreciate that sort of quick synopsis of what you've done. And for those who don't know, when you planted a church here in the United States, it was going extremely well before you left to do other things. So excited to have you in the position you're in, to be able to help think about the work of evangelism in the British context. Let me begin by asking, so given the context of Britain, and you've also been in the context of the US, can you share a little bit about the British context and the similarities and differences you see with the US? In some ways, they're probably similar, but they also are very different in some ways. So can you just share a little bit about the similarities and differences?
Sure. Well, there are lots and lots of cultural differences between Britain and the US. And I think some of those things sort of sit underneath the surface. There's a phrase of being separated by common language. So there we have a similar language in English, and it's used differently. Obviously, American English is different from British English, but there are loads of cultural differences, like there would be between any country. I think the general step I would sort of observe is that Britain, like much of Western Europe, in terms of its relationship to church, to Christendom, to kind of organized religion, however we want to talk about that, is just several decades ahead of where the US is, but is sort of, the trends are kind of seem to be the same. So in the UK, 51% of folks identify with Christianity, which is down from 60% 10 years ago. 38% identify as having no religion, which is up from 32% 10 years ago. And 53% of those in their 20s identify as having no religion. So that gives you a sense of the British public and how they identify in terms of religious affiliation. Interestingly, and I don't know if this would be similar to the States, within the folks who identify as Christian, the numbers are 51% sounds like a lot in some ways to British context. In American context, probably the number would be much higher. But within that 51%, only a third of those folks marked Christian because they believed in the teachings of Christianity. Other folks marked the Christian box because they were baptized Christian as a baby, or because this is a Christian country. So in some ways that are similar to the US, there is a cultural Christianity. But I think that it's waned quite a bit here. So that's the trend lines of UK Christendom. Now, one of the things we are seeing, though, is that, and we see this in the States as well, is though those religious affiliation numbers are going down, there is a marked interest in spirituality among the younger and rising generations. So the same kind of census data reflects, and I don't mean that in any kind of like everyone saying that they believe in a Christian spirituality, but there is, an interest in the paranormal, or people talking about being spiritual but not religious, or other kind of sort of spiritual phenomenon. So there's an interest that's higher in the rising and younger generations than the previous generations, which is sort of interesting. So as religious affiliation declines, spiritual interest seems to be increasing.
Thank you for that, and that is helpful. And I want to sort of unpack one piece of that before we move on. So the religious affiliation declining, certainly we're seeing that here, also to some extent in the US context, where sort of mainline denominations have been in decline for quite a while in this context. The reality is even some non-denominational decline is also happening now, just because of the trend lines you've talked about that have already occurred in the British context. But sticking with the mainline for a minute, the religious affiliation, given that you are affiliated with the Methodist Church of Britain, how are you all sort of dealing with that aspect of the challenge of sort of connecting with people? How do you balance those things?
Well, I think the answer is in a number of very different ways. So the Methodist Church in Britain sort of it's different in its kind of relationship to culture, British culture, than the United Methodist Church relates to U.S. culture. So I sort of hear that the dominant church is the Church of England, the Anglican Church. Mm-hmm. So when I was in the States, I felt like the United Methodist Church was one of the larger Protestant denominations, and I always felt for my Episcopalian colleagues, they had a beautiful tradition, but were sort of, in terms of numerical adherence, was much smaller. Obviously, here it's a sort of flipped script. So here it's the Church of England is the main church and sort of occupies understandably, it's the Church of England, and because of how Britain's constitution works, to the extent there is a constitution, the church and state are joined up, ostensibly kind of joined up. So here, Methodists are kind of a free church is how they're called here, how the Methodist Church is called here. So a free church, or a dissenting church, or a nonconformist church. Now, within Methodism here, loads of different strands, as in Methodism across the world. But I just want to say, like, Methodism occupies a much smaller footprint, and so that said, as the church, the Methodist Church, a few years ago, began sort of paying more attention to these numbers that we were describing, I think realized that there was not a one solution or one way of more fully engaging these trends. And so how have we done it? We're trying to sort of talk about helping established churches get really clear about what their context is, what their mission is, how to engage in their communities and make friends with people they haven't made friends with before, in order that kind of established, maybe more traditional churches might stabilize and renew themselves by God's grace and find a stability. So that's one thing, but also new forms of church planting, pioneering, fresh expressions, and all the different ways of being church or being religious community that may or may not call itself church. So I think just thinking about a term that we use a lot here, which is a term that was, I think, first used by the former Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, the term of the mixed ecology. And I think I really like that term as just a statement of reality, much more than the church. We human beings are a mixed ecology. Organizations are a mixed ecology, but that is a way also of talking about the church's mission and ministry. And I think that's always been the case. If we're honest, the church has always been a mixed ecology and has served God, has glorified God and served God's people and reached out to the world in really different ways. But in a time in the state we find ourselves in now, of kind of with the numbers that we've just described, I think there's even more a need for that kind of mixed ecology approach, not as a desperate approach, but actually one that is, I think, really life-giving, really creativity and energy inspiring, and invites, I think, ministers and missioners and lay and ordained folks, people across the theological spectrum, across the ecclesial spectrum, to know that their gifts are needed and valued, and can be engaged and kind of deployed in this kind of, it's not even one horizon, it's all these different horizons and with all these different kind of people groups. So it is, it could be seen as desperation, but this is sort of where I love to live, is in this space of, one size has probably never fit all. It certainly doesn't fit all now, and that's a beautiful thing. So the Methodist Church is trying to live in that mixed ecology space. I think that as a church, we've always tried to do that. In the past 2 or 3 years, we've made a concerted effort to kind of lean into that and to sort of norm mixed ecology. So that's a lot of what my work is, alongside diverse leaders across the church here in Britain.
Let's sort of unpack that a little bit more, and let's start with established churches. So how do you work with established churches? And established churches in your context are much older than established churches here, of course. So how do you work with them to talk about, the context around you is ever changing, that tradition, of course, is critically important, but you also have to find ways of sharing the tradition, maybe in updated modes. So how do you help those individuals that have sort of firmly been playing it for a number of years to start thinking differently about what it will mean if they want to continue to be vital moving forward?
Well, a number of different ways. I mean, I think One is just starting with prayer and prayer walking or prayer in community. So do our churches, our Christian communities that inhabit buildings in particular places, do they know and love the communities of which they're part? This is basic stuff, this is foundational stuff, but sometimes the foundational and basic stuff is stuff we avoid or just think of we don't pay attention to. So how do churches spend time in their communities kind of consciously, and that we really encourage people to do. Kind of, there are a number of prayer walks, to knock doors, to introduce themselves, not as people who have all the answers, but as people who want to, learn about what their neighbors are anxious about or worried about or need prayer for, just to sort of to build those relationships. What do Christians notice as they walk their neighborhoods? I know there's a woman in a city not too far from here, a little village actually, and she started walking every morning at 6:30 in the morning. That's what she does, and she just has made loads and loads of friends as she's walked every morning at 6:30. And the little village church that she's part of has grown. It's not like tripled in size over the past 2 or 3 years, but it's grown by many, and a number of those folks are people that have come because of my friends walking the village. So it's that kind of stuff. Now, the prayerful walking doesn't always lead to church growth, but it does lead to kind of an understanding of the context. So there's that. It's just knowing your context, and there are loads of different ways to do that. I think the other thing is another thing is thinking about. I always talk about Christianity as first language and Christianity as second language. So those of us who have been part of the church for a long time, maybe been born, baptized, raised in the church, Christianity is our first language. We know the concepts, we know the language, and thanks be to God, first language, is a wonderful thing to have. It's, you can play and with different idiom and thought in the thought world, with so much flexibility and ease when it's your first language. I think one of the things we know is that folks who have not come in contact with church, people who are in that 51%, who've had no contact with organized religion, Christianity will not be their first language. Christianity, if they are to become, people who explore grace and eventually become Christian, they will be learning Christianity as a second language, really. And so I think that the established church, who loves the first language, the expression of Christianity, the first language, has got to do, learn to be at least a translator. So I think there's that is the translation, and perhaps it's not just translation from first language Christianity to second language Christianity, but also maybe to learn a new language together. And I think that is, again, that's really challenging. It's tough to learn a second language. It's tough to teach a second language, but I think it comes down to a couple of things. One is a conceptual kind of approach. So if we are to, this is sort of a basic thing, but if we are to take the words and concepts that we love and know, kind of like our breathing, grace, salvation, transformation, communion, Eucharist, all the language of faith, can we practice talking about those beautiful things, not necessarily throwing that language out. It's but can we translate that language into a vernacular? So are we skilled? Can we skill up to be able to do that translation more regularly? The second thing is, in terms of that second language, is being able to talk about our own spiritual experience, to offer, if I were using the first language, I might say, to give testimony to our experience of God, what it's like to undergo God, one scholar has said. What does it feel like right now, not 10 years ago or 20 years ago or 40 years ago, but right now? What is it like to be undergoing the living God? And I think that kind of question, that testimony, is not only one that is offered to people who are not Christian and maybe exploring grace, but a way of receiving from people who are kind of living in the community, who may be exploring grace, exploring Christianity or not. So I mentioned earlier the kind of increase in spiritual interest among people generally in the UK, at least, and the US too. And so to ask people to talk about their spiritual lives. So we can do that even with folks who aren't in our kind of religious group. One of my colleagues on the Evangelism and Growth team in the Methodist Church here has taken to sort of asking people, tell me about something spiritual that's happened to you lately. And people have an answer to that. Now, some of those answers are really ones that might feel naturally really beautiful to us. Some of them might feel really fringe to us or sort of extraordinary. But I think loads of people are happy to talk about that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So I think, can established churches get, go into that sort of language play, which again is about concept, but also spiritual experience. And I think to the extent that we are, as established and committed and Christians, willing to go into that language, relanguaging, or that language school, we'll be better at not only offering Christ to people who haven't experienced Christ yet, or maybe did and have, for lots of reasons, not been part of the church, but also that we might ourselves, this is one of my big things, we might also receive Christ in ways we didn't expect from people who are living in our neighborhoods, who are not part of our religious group.
Yeah, that's helpful. I appreciate that response. I really appreciate thinking about the first and second language, because I think you're right on target. And here in the US, I think more and more we need to start thinking in that same manner. We've sort of taken it for granted that everybody knows the Christian language, but that certainly is not true today in ways that it was at one point in time.
Yeah, so like we talk about like teaching Spanish as a second language, right? So what does it look like to teach Christianity as a second language?
Yeah. That's good. Let's sticking with the mixed sort of ecology. Let's now talk sort of about fresh expressions. Which started in England, of course, have come here also to the United States. And fresh expressions being thinking about ways to create faith communities that may look more like traditional churches, but also don't look like traditional churches, that they are expressed in various forms and fashion. So how are you working to create these sort of fresh expressions of faith communities, and who do you find to start these communities?
Well, we talk about, so Fresh Expressions movement did indeed start here in England, and it was a project of an ecumenical project. It was by the C of E, the Church of England, and the Methodist Church. So we're really proud. It's one of the things that British Methodists are really proud of, is that kind of that project started ecumenically here with the C of E, and it's wonderful to see it kind of coming into its own in the U.S. context in different ways. So just for those of you who are listening who don't know Fresh Expressions, it really is a broad spectrum, as you said, Doug. It's really communities of Christianity, communities of spiritual exploration that are designed particularly by and for people who are unaffiliated, people who are not currently part of the church. And, across the spectrum might be a Fresh Expression might be a really big kind of worshiping community. It might be a really small micro church. It might be a social enterprise that has a discipleship pathway built into it. It sort of, the sky's the limit, really. And so I think what we're finding here in the British Methodist Church, we started using the language of new places for new people to describe that spectrum. Here, Fresh Expressions often kind of refers to a really, really small kind of micro church. Or micro experiment, which is really beautiful. The small is beautiful, but it can sometimes refer only to that. And so we wanted a broader term to sort of hold, for Methodists at least here, to hold all these different kinds of experiments and modalities for creating new faith community, new spiritual community for people who are unaffiliated. So again, across the spectrum, what we're looking for folks who start those is many of the things that you will know about in the United Methodist Church around a love for people who are not part of church, a natural kind of a natural connection to folks who are not part of church, people who enjoy talking about big, deep spiritual issues, people who go where people are living their lives and are more interested in sort of making community and space where they are living their lives, as opposed to trying to get them to come to a place where religious people are living their lives. So people who are happy in spaces beyond church buildings, and maybe are willing to even think about church beyond the church building, forever, sort of permanently. People who like starting new things, people who are really, really interested in moving beyond the one-on-one. The one-on-one relationship at the beginning is really, really important. Who can move beyond the one-on-one sort of pastoral chaplaincy kind of relationship into creating community around a big idea, around a spiritual process. And so we found in the British Methodist Church, sort of unlike the United Methodist Church, most of the pioneers, as they're called here, are lay folks. Now we have started sort of, there are some ministers, ordained ministers, who are pioneers, but and we want to see more ordained ministers who are pioneers. But it started as mostly as a lay movement, and so. Which
going back to Wesleyan roots.
Going back to those Wesleyan roots, absolutely. And I think, it's a wonderful thing. I think it means that there's a gift in that, there's a joy in that. I think there's a challenge in that too, around I think sometimes the recognition of the ministry. And I think even in a church, the British Methodist Church, which has that rich DNA of being a lay movement, I think sometimes we all have times where clericalism kind of overrides what the Spirit's doing in lay leadership. We really guard against that, but I think sometimes that does happen. So, but we love that lay folks are reminding us of what the church of the past has been like, and what the church of the future can be like if we are in the present all working together. So I always say that lay folks are also reminding ordained folks what their ministry should be more like more of the time. So yeah.
That's great. Well, Trey, as we get ready to bring this to a close, I want you to look into sort of your spiritual crystal ball and think about 10 years from now, where you would like to see the Methodist Church of Britain move, given sort of the work that you're doing. If you could just paint a picture, maybe I'll give you two questions. If you could paint a picture where you would like to see it move, and where do you think it will be at that point in time? So I'll let you sort of think about it in both ways.
I would love to see a church that commits to evangelism as a core part of our discipleship, that it's not something for only a particular theological orientation, but something that we all are committed to. Everybody is an evangelist, we say in the British Methodist Church, that we might lean into that. And I think with that sense that we are all called to be evangelists across the diversity of the human spectrum, can release, instead of a few evangelists for a church, it could release, the thousands and thousands of committed Methodists to be evangelists. I think in that commitment to be evangelists, I think an expectation that we in our evangelism will be evangelized alongside of the people that we are in relationship with. Sometimes God will evangelize us in the process of being in evangelism. Sometimes the folks that we go out to evangelize will evangelize us, So I think that kind of mutuality, that reciprocity, that we expect God's goodness, we expect to hear it from others as much as we expect to speak it to others, and that we would all live that out together. I think that mutuality is so crucial. I think I would love to see churches established and new places for new people be really, really committed to developing one-on-one relationships in their community, and making that a sort of a core practice as well of discipleship, going out routinely, turning over every stone, asking people for coffee, building that kind of relationship building into their discipleship. I would love to see church planting and pioneering become a top priority for every district's mission strategy. that it would be not only a sort of an optional extra, but would be well, of course, this is just what we do because, we're Methodist Christians. We plant churches, we start new Christian communities. I would love to see the church kind of just take missional risks to go where the people are. And this could be, community festivals, sports clubs, all the places where people live their lives, the margins, economic margins, where people are impoverished, and not just to go and to be in mission to these places, but to expect God to ask God to show us the leaders that God is raising up already in those places. I think one of the things that's most exciting right now, in my opinion, in the world is seeing all of these movements for social change, for environmental justice, for social transformation, and seeing how many of the leaders are young and more able to talk about transformation in multi-leveled and wonderful kind of ways that acknowledge past oppression and liberation as something that God's offering to us. So I'm interested in how these movements kind of credential their leaders. And so I look forward to how the church can learn from those movements as we welcome younger and more diverse leaders that God's already raising them up in different places and different parts of God's creation. So how can we learn from them? I pray that we'll be able to go where God leads and to the big gritty questions, and not be afraid of people, talking about their experience of God in ways that might sort of be outside of our norm, to sort of norm the weird. I always talk about, in some ways you don't want the church to be weird and you don't want the church to be kind of odd and sort of a negative way, but to norm, you want the church to be distinctive. And I think we have a lot to learn from folks who are kind of at the margins and these burgeoning movements.
Well, Trey, thank you so much. This has been wonderful. It was great to sort of get a glimpse into your world and the work that you're doing, and I'm excited. I think you paint a picture that seems very possible given what has taken place right now. So appreciation for your sharing with us today.
My pleasure.
Thanks for joining us for Leading Ideas Talks. Please like and subscribe to this channel and click the bell icon to get updates for new videos.